Hello, everyone. Welcome to today's live cast from the UBS Center. We all live traces in this world. These traces today are called data. Technological progress has made it possible to collect, analyze, and interpret this data in an almost unimaginably comprehensive way. Some of you may remember the 2015 study from Stanford, according to which Facebook knows your personality better than your boss after only 10 likes and better than your friends after 70 likes. And we all know the feeling of Google suggesting ads for something we secretly wanted but never really were looking for. And then, of course, we have the scandals in mind where companies have unlawfully collected data. But data can also be used to do good. I say this not at least as a scientist myself, whose main task is to draw insights from the data. And that's exactly what today's talk will be about. My name is David Yanagizawa-Drott. I am a professor of development and emerging markets at the Department of Economics at the University of Zurich. I'm also an affiliated professor at the UBS Center. I'm very happy to have Greg Crawford here today with us, who's a leading expert in big data analysis. Greg is amazing. He's a chief economist at Zalando, professor of economics at the University of Zurich, and a co-founder and former director of the Research and Policy Network on Competition Policy. He holds a PhD in economics from Stanford University. Today, Greg will talk about big data and how to make better business decisions with them. But before we start, here's some information from you. We want this to be interactive, and Greg has prepared a little quiz for you. And after the presentation, we will have a Q&A session. You can ask questions during Greg's presentation or vote on other questions. So please take your mobile right now or open a tab in your web browser and go to menti.com and dial in with the code 5599460. 5599460. Then you can press Open Q&A, and there you will see how the interface works. If you don't have any questions, you can still log in and see all the submitted questions, and also vote for the best ones by giving them a thumbs up. So, with that said, Greg, welcome and take it away.
Thank you very much, David. It's my pleasure to be here. And let me thank the UBS Center for inviting me to give this talk today. It's been a little bit of a journey. I'll introduce myself a bit beyond what you said. So, as David mentioned, I'm a professor at the University of Zurich, and I've been a professor for a very long time. I'm also a UBS affiliated professor. And about 4 or 5 years before I decided to join Zalando, I started really to move into the policy space, moving from academic research into policy. And now for the last 18 months, I'm now at Zalando as their first ever chief economist. So their first time with this role, and also my first time in a corporate job. But there's one thread which connects all these positions, which also characterizes all the work that I've done, which is I always try to let data tell its story. And the talk today is going to be about that. So as you said, I have a few quiz questions coming up, but I have to tease a little bit the UBS Center. I gave a talk last October, and it was also about unleashing the power of data to make better business decisions, and they had this nice image, which I think captures the feeling these days, which is I'm as excited as she is to see what's around the corner, because I think there's quite a bit that's still uncertain. Okay, but now we jump to the quiz. So as David said, if you can open your phones or computers to menti.com. There's two related questions, and it relates to how businesses make decisions with data, right? So if you, for those of you that have been around for a little while, and you imagine back 15 years ago to how your company at that time that you were working at, if you have that experience, made decisions with data, there's a number of ways they might have done it. So they might have used focus groups. They might have done a strategic analysis informed by assumptions by the most experienced leaders. They might have done strategic analysis informed by whatever data they had available. They might have tried to inform their decision with A/B testing or other various strategies. And this quiz is really about this, is imagine 15 years ago at how your company or the company you were aware of at that time, if you have other experience, initially chose to make decisions about important strategic choices facing the company, maybe to roll out a new product, to roll out a new service, to potentially change features of an existing portfolio of services, this kind of thing, maybe enter a new line of business, this kind of thing. And of course, one of the options, which is still, I think is always in the room, is making the decision by the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion. So this is a not uncommon way to make decisions. And so I see now in the quiz, we're starting to get results, and I see actually the hippo is, among those, the last column here is respondents that don't have experience to answer the question, totally reasonable if you're new in your career, but we see that the hippo is actually quite popular, quite a popular opinion, also along with using assumptions informed by whatever data was available. Okay, so super, thank you all for participating, and now we're gonna ask the same question, and maybe we'll get even more respondents. What about today? How would decisions be made at the company you work at today? Same portfolio of options, right? And it'll be interesting to see if we see the same portfolio of responses. To what extent has it changed? So to what extent, whereas in the past, the decision might have been made by the hippo, the highest paid person's opinion, or by assumptions made by the person with the most experience, to what extent are companies, in your experience, you, the audience's experience, now making decisions with more data? And indeed, we do see, in fact, we don't have any hippos at the moment. There's a few. And we see actually quite a bit, by far the strongest result today seems to be strategic analyses being informed by some data. But the key thing for me is not so much by A/B testing, and that's going to be a topic that we're going to discuss over the course of the talk here. Okay, so feel free, for the respondents, feel free to keep answering. We'll keep these live, so we can come back to this if we like at the end. But let me now come back to this point. And if you think about, well, what's changed? What's changed in these last 15 years? And this is an old New Yorker cartoon. What's funny is I'm giving this talk now here in 2024. I gave a version of this talk back in 2010. And so this cartoon is from 2010. And indeed, this is an Economist cover also from 2010. And it talks about the data deluge and how the world was changing even back then. And back then, on the left panel was a graph from that Economist, which showed how the amount of information was in exabytes, rising up to a forecast of 2,000 exabytes in 2011. And on the right panel is a figure from last autumn in the Financial Times, which shows that now we're talking about 200,000 exabytes here 14 years later. And so the quote back then from The Economist was, mankind created 150 exabytes of data in 2005. This year, 2010, it'll create 1,200. And data are becoming the new raw material of business, an economic input almost on par with capital and labor. And I totally agree with that sentiment, but the question is, which data and how do you use it? And that's really what I want to talk about today. So the way I'm going to start is I'm going to try to present a hierarchy of business problems. And this hierarchy just comes in part from my experience of the last 18 months with Zalando, but also from my experience interacting with other economists that have moved into the private sector over the last 15 years. And so let me start by saying, well, what are the problems facing a business? And how might we use data, or indeed other tools, and I will also talk about other tools in addition to data, to answer these problems. And in my feeling, I see two main types of business problems. First, there are problems where the future is like the past, and there are what-if problems where the future is not like the past. So let me talk about each of these. So first, group one. When the future is like the past, it is often appropriate to use forecasting or prediction methods. So for example, if you have a buying budget, if you're planning capacity, if you have a logistics algorithm, there are all kinds of problems where companies can learn from the recent past to predict what will happen in the near future when they anticipate that the underlying economic environment is essentially the same, right? And in this space, data scientists are preeminent. Sometimes they work with operational research experts, especially on topics like logistics and capacity, that have large-scale optimization expertise. And when I say data scientists, just because this is a word that means different things to different people, let me say what I mean is people usually with a statistics cross-computer science background, often using machine learning or artificial intelligence tools. So these are the guys and gals that are working on forecasting and predicting. But there's another group of questions. And this other group of questions is, in my view, more common. And it's a case where the business wants to answer a what-if question. For example, the question would typically start, say, what would happen to our revenue, profit, new customer acquisition, whatever? There's all kinds of business KPIs, key performance indicators. So what would happen to some of our KPIs if we, for example, reach an agreement to carry the goods from brand X? Or what would happen if we change the features of our loyalty program? Or what would happen if we change a key customer-facing algorithm? The key thing here, then there's many, many more. The key thing here is that the future is not like the past. We're changing something, and we want to understand what will happen in the new future, in the changed future where we've made some business decision. And so in my experience, there are thousands of business problems to solve for every business of this type, right? So because the majority of these business decisions are given by answers to what-if business questions, that makes them very interesting and very relevant. And the key thing here is these are causal questions. The business wants to know, hey, if I change my loyalty program, what's going to happen? That's a causal effect. I'm going to do X, and they want to know why will happen, right? And the beautiful thing is that's what economics does. Economics at least tries to answer causal what-if questions. And that's a key distinction between data scientists that are often forecasting and economists, in my view, that are often trying to answer what-if questions. Okay, so suppose you're still in the second group and you're interested in some particular what-if question. What does success look like for a particular what-if question? In my view, a successful answer to a business problem has three key elements. Often you can't achieve all three, but this is the ideal. You try to find estimates of the causal effect of a given business instrument on long-run outcomes, because we're not interested in just optimizing for today's business performance. We typically want to maximize the long-run value of our business. And critically, we want to segment those causal effects. We want to understand how are those causal effects different by customer, by product, by market, by delivery method, whatever, by some dimension of interest to the business. And why? Why do we want that segmentation? Because we want to do more of what works, and we want to do less of what doesn't work. Okay? So that's what success looks like. How do you do it? Okay, great. That's where we want to go. So how exactly does economics, and by the way, I don't mean to be too imperial here. There are other scientific disciplines that also are interested in these what-if questions. By chance, I come to them from an economics lens, so I think economics can often answer these causal what-if questions. How? In my mind, there's a three-step approach. First, experimentation where feasible and efficient. So experimentation is always the go-to method when possible. When it's not possible, for example, suppose it's not feasible. Maybe it's not feasible because the underlying question is a future-oriented question, or maybe it's not possible because it's too costly to run an experiment. Where it's not feasible, what can you do? Well, if it's a future-oriented question, we might use applied economic theory, or we might use, if we do have data, it's a sort of contemporary question, and we do have some data, but it's just not feasible to quickly run an experiment or effectively run an experiment, we might try to use econometric causal inference methods. Also, there's a case where it may just not be efficient. There's a cursive dimensionality problem. So at Zalando, for example, we carry over 7,000 brands, and we might be interested in, well, how important is one particular brand? You know, it's hard to imagine running 7,000 contemporary experiments, especially across different customer segments or price points or something like this, and therefore it's not efficient necessarily to think about running every possible experiment. And so then you can think about, well, let's run a subset of the possible experiment, and then let's use structural econometric methods to try to learn from that subset of experiments to make predictions about experiments that we would have liked to have run but didn't. Okay? So that's another case where economics can help. And a final case is sometimes there are just economic questions where we want to add on top of experimental results. So for example, we might run an experiment, but there could be strategic responses from other players, suppliers, advertisers, competitors, and we can't run necessarily experiments on our competitors, right? We have to anticipate what our competitors will do, and again, this is a case where economics can play a role and provide answers to those kind of what-if questions. Now, so what's the aspiration, I think, for business is, and we're not there for sure in businesses across the economy, but the aspiration where there is data available is to achieve the holy grail of thousands of experiments, estimating the return on investment of various business activities, where the insights are then accumulated and traded off within automated steering algorithms, and optimized decisions varied by country, customer type, customer intent, partner type, location, time, etc. And of course, the dimensions they might vary are going to vary business by business according to the important drivers of a given business's performance. To me, I think there's a nice analogy between this holy grail. It's like the difference between personalized medicine, and there's like billions being invested now in personalized medicine, and what my local doctor thinks is going to work, right? And we're moving that in that direction with all of business. In the past, it's been a bit more what the hippo might think works, and now we have the potential with data to really learn what actually does work. Okay. Now, I'm not going to go through it in the slides, but I'm happy to share these slides after the talk, and I have a link here to companies in the back of the deck that have experimentation platforms and are pursuing this approach to inform their decision making. And they're some of the most valuable companies in the world. So we're talking Amazon, Uber, Netflix, Microsoft. I have an example in the back with LinkedIn. LinkedIn, for example, runs 35,000 A/B tests daily. 35,000 simultaneous A/B tests daily. And I think that number is even old. I'm sure it's more by now. And so later, if you're interested, you can see a few of those examples. So that's my first sort of thesis, is to lay out my vision of how I see businesses across the economy making decisions. But I also want to talk about a second aspect of this, which is how do you get there? And I see a two-level skills gap. So the talk today isn't only about these business problems and the tools to solve them, it's about who is going to solve these problems, right? And there are, I think, two parts to this problem. First, who's going to choose the right tool for the right problem? And second, given a problem, who will analyze that data to find its answer? Now, I'm going to start with the second one first because it's a little bit easier. So let's start with who's going to analyze the data. And the answer is a new kind of professional has emerged. This is actually a quote from Hal Varian, the chief economist at Google at the time, I think still, from this Economist article of 2010. So this quote is 15 years old, but it still applies, I think. A new kind of professional has emerged, the data scientist, who combines the skills of a software programmer, a statistician, and a storyteller or artist to extract the nuggets of gold hidden under mountains of data. Okay? Now, when I first gave this talk, he further said, data are widely available. What is scarce is the ability to extract wisdom from them. I totally continue to agree with that conclusion. Now, when I first gave this talk back in 2011, I actually changed this slightly. I changed data scientist to econometrician, and I changed storyteller/artist to interpreter, because I don't think we should tell stories from data. I think we should let data tell its story, and therefore I feel the role of the data analyst is to be the interpreter of the data. But this was the old version. In my 2024 version, I would now say there are two kinds of professionals, the data scientist and the econometrician. Everything else I stick to. And why two? For the same reason at the beginning of the talk, I had two types of business problems. Because data scientists specialize in prediction problems when the future is like the past, and econometricians specialize in causal inference problems when the future is not like the past. Okay, but, so these are the guys who are going to do it, but still, what about the right tool for the right problem? There's an additional problem here. People that look like that run the business. people that look like that make the business run. And can they talk to each other? And if not, why not? So not only in my experience, but talking to colleagues that have been in industry for a long time, business leaders who wish to use data for business decision making and applied scientists tasked with analyzing that data often struggle to communicate with each other effectively. And why? Because business leaders often lack the technical skill, and applied scientists often lack the business experience. And in the first case, the business leaders have trouble knowing what's been done and what possibly might otherwise have been done. And the latter have trouble knowing really what's needed from a business perspective. And both have trouble, particularly when there are trade-offs to be made. And there are always trade-offs to be made. There are always technical trade-offs, and there are always business trade-offs. And so there's this communication gap. And so in my view, a further skill is needed. We need, and I don't know quite what to call them yet. This is still a little bit, I'm new in this space, and so I'm still thinking out loud to myself. Systems engineers or conductors or interpreters. But it's people with a diverse set of skills. So I think we need people with skills in business, obviously. Skills in applied economic theory for those what-if questions that are especially future-oriented about strategy, long-run strategy questions. People with skills in statistics and econometrics to do both effective A/B testing and causal effects estimation. Data scientists to handle the prediction and forecasting problems. But you also need a bit of engineering to understand the basics of data pipelines, data products, tracking methods, and the tools needed to collect effectively and use effectively data, and not least, communication skills. To connect these different disciplines in a coherent narrative that a diverse range of, a diverse audience can understand. So this is a quote from Susan Athey, a friend of mine. We went to grad school together a long time ago. Fabulous. And I love this quote, and it's from 4 or 5 years ago. In my experience, MBAs who have a good business intuition but can also speak the language of statisticians intelligently are rock stars. They know how to use data to prove a point, they present the information well visually, and they pull together a collection of empirical facts that all support the main conclusion. People with this set of talents are poached by other firms and quickly promoted. They are the go-to people on any sort of major strategic project. So that's Susan Athey, currently professor, well, currently sort of chief economist at the Department of Justice, on leave as a professor of economics at the Stanford Graduate School of Business, and also former chief economist at Microsoft. So my second thesis is that some economists also have this skill set, especially empirical economists, aka econometricians, and especially competition econometricians. And before I say why, we have our last Menti question, and it relates to Amazon. So here's a little quiz for you. So how many PhD economists work, do you think, audience, dear audience, work in detailed business operations for Amazon? So not in like some research capacity, but actually down in the weeds, helping them make sort of their products better, their services better, to help them make better business decisions. And just as a reference point, because you need something, in any given year, there's about 20,000 students that graduate with a master's in business administration that are clearly targeted for business, and about 1,000 young men and women who graduate with PhDs in economics. Right? So how many these days do you think does Amazon have employed sort of across the business? And it really is across the business. I mean, Amazon has many lines of business. They have, of course, their core retail marketplace, where they both are a wholesaler, but also run a marketplace where other firms can sell goods and services. They have Amazon Web Services, and they have Amazon Instant Video. They have media products, and so they have, of course, many scope for help on many different types of business decisions. And so as soon as we get to a pretty good number here, I'll give you the answer. But the guesses here, the leading guess is between 75 and 200, with the second guess of more than 800. But all the answers are skewing high, which is correct. You should skew high. And the actual correct answer is the 300 to 800. They have around 450 or 500 PhD economists integrated into their business all across the company. So, okay, so why? So why is it the case that economists and econometricians are so valuable? And what's interesting in this slide, Amazon was an early adopter or early innovator in hiring PhD economists into their business. They hired Pat Byery, their first chief economist, I think 15 years ago. And he's just a professor of economics in the same field I work in. And they now have 500. But now other tech companies are following suit. So Google, Facebook, Uber, Netflix, Microsoft, et cetera, are really starting to hire PhD economists. So why? Why do they do this? Well, why might these economists with data skills, in other words, econometricians, be well suited to pick the right tool for the right problem? And the answer is because econometrics is three things. Econometrics is, in my view, incredibly useful. It's increasingly useful, and it can be used to do good, in this case, do good business, but only if it's good econometrics. Okay, and so what is good econometrics? In my view, good econometrics encompasses three pillars. First, an understanding of the economic forces generating the data. This is a distinction often between econometricians and statisticians. The specification of an econometric model and estimation approach that can accurately and flexibly measure those forces, so letting the data tell its story. And finally, a careful interpretation of the results, knowing when to have confidence in the results, knowing when to have a little concern that this may be the best we can do, but we're not totally sure. We don't want to bank our whole bankroll on that result, etc. And so, so I said in a few slides ago, it's in particular good competition econometricians often have fit well with this. And why? Because often competition econometricians, so econometricians that study competition, have training in applied competition economics, which is basically consumer behavior and how firms interact, which is not unsurprisingly relevant for business. They have core training in causal effects estimation. They're not experts in forecasting and data science, but they're at least often familiar with them. They have comfort with data cleaning, programming, optimization, the kinds of tools that are going on behind the scenes in these kinds of problems. And they have comfort making trade-offs between scientific rigor and the demands of real business problems. And so my strongly held belief, it's not so much about competition econometricians, but my strongly held belief is that this set of skills, wherever they come from, this is the future. I really believe it. And so I think firms all across the economy should prepare for it. And we can talk in the Q&A about how, and also how to produce such skills at scale, right? And so I have ideas, and I'm happy to discuss those maybe in the Q&A. So let me conclude. I just have a few slides to conclude. So I firmly believe that a new era is coming for making better decisions with big data. The last 15 years until today was really about applying existing tools to new data. So you hire engineers, product managers, and data scientists, and you pair them with normal business leaders and business analysts. But of course, there's still this communication gap. But from today, I think what we're going to see in business is businesses developing new tools and capabilities for new data. For example, building experimentation platforms. Zalando has one. And to hire and train, to find, hire, and train these interpreters that can effectively connect business leaders to applied data scientists. Are these capabilities necessary? Do we need them? Does every company need them? So my view is the returns to these processes are enormous. They're effectively giving you an investment in better decision making. And every business needs to make decisions all the time. So the companies that are at the frontier implementing them now are among the best performing companies in the world. I mentioned already, Microsoft, Amazon, Netflix. And my view is that companies that lag behind will be at a significant competitive disadvantage. And so therefore, for both offensive reasons and for defensive reasons, it's worth thinking about how to build these capabilities from right now. So I'll pause there. I thank you all, and I look forward to the Q&A and to having a discussion on these topics. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Greg.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So let me say one thing to the audience first. Please go to menti.com and add additional questions that you may have, or just go and vote for some of the questions that already have been posted. So Greg, there was a lot of interesting big ideas that you went through there. I have some experience of sort of working with businesses and organizations, also kind of pushing some of the similar ideas that you have, and I recognize a lot of the challenges that you highlight. So let me ask you, and maybe I can play a little bit of a devil's advocate role here, or pretend sort of that you're the skilled professor knowing these toolboxes that are available, and I'm, say, a business leader.
Mm-hmm.
Because I imagine that there are people in the audience right now, they are, running companies, or there are some managerial position, and they're kind of listening to you and thinking, okay, this sounds interesting, but I have a number of questions for you, right? Okay, so let me start with the first one. Let's call it the why and the when question,
Okay.
right? So imagine I'm a business leader, and I'm saying, we're not Netflix, we're not Amazon, we don't have an experimental platform, we don't have this in-house capability, but we're doing fine.
Mm-hmm.
And I look at my competition, I look at my peers in the same industry, they're also not using these tools.
Mm-hmm.
They're also fine, right? So why should I use it? And then, let me perhaps be a bit more concrete, because you can imagine that for some companies, it's a no-brainer. They should, like, starting tomorrow, start looking into it. But then there are other companies for which maybe the underlying data infrastructure, or there are certain parameters where it's perhaps less compelling. So maybe you can be a little bit more concrete of, which businesses should start dealing with this, and which ones should perhaps not think about it.
Sure, I'm happy to. And totally fair question. Let me say, in my current role, I'm often asked just exactly this question: why? Why should we be doing this? So it's not one that I haven't heard before, and I think it's a totally fair one and a totally reasonable one. And I think let me start by trying to think about the types of businesses first for which this approach that I'm proposing would make the most sense, or at least make the most sense early relative to late, right? And I think first is where can you learn from the data? Where do you have the data? So, if you look at some of the companies that I talked about, they are providing digital services. So Netflix, is it Spotify? These are digital companies. And so their whole product is data. And so they live purely in a digital world, in a data world, and therefore it makes sense. Companies like Zalando or Amazon or Uber, Amazon and Zalando deliver products, so there's a physical element to it, but of course it's still an e-commerce platform. Still, the interface is a digital interface between the company and the consumer and the customer. So these, obviously, and these are all also relatively big companies, right? So I think that's where it's going to start. You can already see that's why it started there already. What I would say is, what I see is that eventually there will be data on everything, right? So right now we're talking about either digital products or digitally delivered digital interfaces for the delivery of physical products. But with the Internet of Things, our screen is going to talk to us. Your jacket is going to tell you, it's been a while since you've been dry cleaned. Since I've been dry cleaned. David, can you take me to the dry cleaner? And by the way, they're having a sale right now, right? And so I think as ever more data becomes available, that's going to increase the returns for these kinds of business activities. That being said, I think the way, of course, an experimentation platform doesn't come for free. And so the way, but it's a little bit, I think Google is a little bit famous for this, but it's the try, fail, learn, right? And so any company that's thinking about this, you don't need an experimentation platform to run an A/B test. So try it. Pick a big question that you think you can get a precise answer using an A/B test, and try it. And see if the decision-making process from doing that is better than what you would have done previously. So of course there's some investment involved there. And then, because that's a little bit how you build a flywheel. And I have a slide on this to this effect in the back of my deck, where you try it, you see the value of the decision, you say, okay, let's do a few more. You try it, you do a few more, okay, now let's invest in some of the engineering infrastructure and some of the analytical infrastructure and the applied science infrastructure. but it should always be incremental. I mean, but the premise here is that the returns to this are high for most businesses. But of course, any given business should just give it a shot.
Fantastic. Now, thinking about the how a little bit more, would you recommend that companies start looking at building in-house, or are there already, outside expertise companies offering these services? Suppose I want to start with some small-scale experimentation. Sort of, what exists in the market today in this regard?
Yeah. So this is a good question. This build versus buy question is always present. I think there are companies out there. So, for example, Zalando partners with third-party company for the analysis of our experimental data. The experimentation platform is in-house. I do think there's a challenge of especially integrating third-party companies into the nitty-gritty engineering infrastructure of companies, right? So I think there's both an operational challenge there as well as potentially a privacy challenge, right? And so to me, that favors slightly the build aspect on some of the, if you might call early funnel elements of this kind of process. But of course, it's early days, and if the returns really are that high and the expertise is not easy to gain within each individual company, that's going to give strong incentives for third-party providers to arise and solve these problems. So I anticipate probably there will be valuable third-party providers providing different elements of this. And let me emphasize also, it requires a complementary set of capabilities. I talked today about a little bit the economist part of it, but you also need the underlying raw data, you need the underlying engineering infrastructure, you need the underlying tracking infrastructure, and so data, sort of data facility, data products, because you want to make this self-service. You don't want to have, if you want to do it at scale, you want decentralized teams throughout an organization to be able to do these kinds of things. Mm-hmm. And these are all complements, so they're going to take time. Mm-hmm. And so it's going to depend for each business on figuring out, well, we're strong, we have, in-house 2-3 of these, but we're weak in these others, and let's look for third parties for those others, that kind of thing.
All right, great. So I'm looking at some of the questions from the audience here.
Sure.
One of the most popular ones that people would like to get your thoughts on is, it comes back to, I think, this ROI question, which is, what are the key performance indicators, KPIs, that will measure the success of big data initiatives, right? So I think what they're asking is, okay, so I'm going to now spend some money,
right, sure,
either in-house or some combination with, some third party. It's going to cost me something, right? But how do I know if it's worth the investment, right? Yeah. So can you speak a little bit about?
Yeah, I mean, it's a little bit like this. Happy to. I mean, and it's funny because I think what we're talking about essentially is investing in a decision-making process, right? And so at some level, you want to do an A/B test, right? You want to
right.
you want to test how might we have made this decision over here, versus how might we make it if we sort of did some formal, actual A/B testing on the different business options that we're considering. And so, of course, when you do the formal A/B testing, you'll be able to measure the standard KPIs a business is interested in that particular decision. Maybe it's to carry a particular brand on your platform or on in your business. But then what you have to do is compare it to how you would have made a decision before, right? And the good news is, if the A/B test it will give you a measure, if you like, of the incremental profit. Ideally, I talked earlier about the goal is always 3-part. You want the causal effect, so you want to make sure it really is a causal effect, and an A/B test would give you that. Of the long run benefit, so the long run effect, segmented by different ways. But if you can do the A/B test, it will tell you, well, the profit increment of doing this strategy in this case is X million, or X 100,000, or X thousand, whatever it might be. And then you can compare that to what you might have otherwise chosen, and that's a hard comparison. But so you may not get a clear answer that way, but you can certainly also compare it to the cost you had to pay to make that decision. So you'd love to compare the difference in the increment in profitability against that cost, but at least you might not have the the difference, but at least you'll have the pure increment of doing the A/B test. So that's a start, but it's also ultimately going to depend on how business leaders feel about decision making in that way.
Right.
Yeah.
So because you've seen this in action a few times now, is there something about the A/B testing that also changes, not just giving you kind of data, understanding the impact of, say, in doing A versus B, but perhaps changes how the management thinks about its company and what's possible? Or does it sort of lead to some sort of feedback loops in that regard, that there's a learning process and sort of you start thinking about what else could we do that we didn't think about before and so on?
I mean, here it's a little bit hard because I'm new at Zalando, right? So I can say, I mean, not necessarily speaking about specific senior leaders, but certainly with project partners, you know, there is this aha moment where they're like, wow, you know, like when we did this before, we just had these beliefs about what the effect of this was going to be, and now we actually just see it, right? And so, so I think that's how it starts, is these aha moments, and then of course, if you have a good aha moment, then they say, okay, well, let's do that again, right? You know, and I think ultimately what will change cultures or senior business leaders' minds are wins. At the end of the day, every business leader wants wins, right? And so if this method delivers wins, it'll be adopted, and it's just that simple.
For sure.
Yeah.
So we've talked a lot about the upside. There's a question here about the potential downside.
Mm-hmm.
So what are the potential risks and challenges associated with leveraging big data, and how will they be mitigated, or can be mitigated, I guess?
Yeah. I mean, I think, of course, we've seen, and look, as I mentioned in my introduction, before I went to Zalando, I really worked in this policy space, and I really feel actually as a competition economist that the antitrust community has dropped the ball on seeing the harms of the exploitation of data. So I've written about this many times. You can go to the CEPR website, where I mentioned I was this co-founder of a competition policy network, and I've written about that in several different contexts. And so I think there are genuine dangers associated with data exploitation. I think what's a little bit encouraging, so where I work now, the opportunities we're exploiting are really win-win. So in the case of Zalando, we're trying to be the starting point for fashion. And so customers want to find that perfect sweater, and brands want them to find that perfect sweater. So that's, I think there's alignment there. Right. Where you see more challenging places is where in advertising supported models, for example, where a Google or a Facebook has an incentive to promote, for example, mis or disinformation because they can monetize it, because consumers want to consume that. That's really where you see the dangers. And ultimately, I think we just need strong regulation. I think you need, and already, so in Europe is in the forefront there, at least in theory, with the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, to try to provide those regulatory protections to consumers. The US is considering legislation in these same dimensions, but you know, the US is a very difficult place politically, so the jury is still out on that one. But ultimately, I think there needs to be strong protections on the inappropriate exploitation of data.
Very good. Your title has big data in it, mm-hmm. and you know, I think we talked about especially the big benefits when you have big data mm-hmm. of these kinds of tools. But there's a question here, which is how to make decisions with help of small data. Yeah. I am in charge of a Swiss SME, mm-hmm. and I do not have many data, about 50 million turnover mm-hmm. per year. Mm-hmm. You know, you know, what is small data here? What's big data, and sort of at what point is it too small?
Exactly. No, I think that's it's a really important question, and it's even a question so Zalando, of course, has 50 million active customers, and we have a big turnover, and of course it makes it easier, right? Because ultimately, the first thing you do when you're considering an A/B test is you have to evaluate the power of the experiment, right? So what is the likely potential effect of the test, and do I have enough data in this experiment to get an effect that I can distinguish from noise, right? And if you're an SME, you may just not have that base. And the beautiful thing here is actually, that's why I really think economists have a really unique skill set, is because economists can blend data with theory, right? And so economists can, like, even if you didn't have any data, I mean, I would go back to the business leader that wrote the question. How do you make decisions now? Of course, you have some view of your product, your firm's products, where it's positioned in the market relative to competitors, where you see the market evolving. And then what I would say is try to test those beliefs against whatever data you can find, right? And so there's scope absolutely for a blend of small data decision making as well as big data decision making. But in essence, what you would love is to have the skills in-house to be able to do both, right? Maybe for his company, maybe an experimentation platform or A/B testing isn't commonly going to be useful, but I bet it still would be useful for big bets, because big bets that have big impacts are going to, those effects will be visible even with small sample sizes in an A/B test. So,
but there's something of a trade-off there, where the bigger is the data, the more customers you have, and maybe the more feasible experimentation is, the more is the upside, arguably.
Yeah.
And thinking a little bit about, say, the economics of experimentation, would you say that there's something of a, say, fixed cost of setting up the infrastructure, but then actually running one A/B test could be done almost for free in some sense, right?
Yeah.
And so once you have a lot of data, it seems like even if, say, you increase net revenue by only, say, 1% or 0.5%, right? If the total pie, is $100 million business, then basically the return on that investment of that experiment is incredibly high.
Yeah,
right? Is that the right way to think about it?
That's exactly how I think the answer is yes. And I have an example in the appendix of the slides that talks about Uber, where they A/B test every product development, because even a 0.1% change in revenue is like 100 million, right? Yeah. so that rationalizes a lot of investment in fixed costs, right? And but I think there's an interesting consequence of that for the competitiveness of the economy as a whole, right? And because then, we then start talking about, I'm a competition economist, and you see the rise of markups across the economy in developed economies, the US and in Europe, and the rise of superstar firms. Our colleague, David Dorn has written extensively about this. And it's yet another example of a case where there might be an advantage to being big, right? And so that, I think that's a real danger from a competition perspective, because if there are significant fixed costs that make the minimum efficient scale in many businesses very large, then of course you're not going to get much competition, or you're going to expect to have less competition than if it were smaller. So that's a bit of a danger.
Get a winner take it all sort of scenario.
I mean, you could get winner take it all, or at least winner take most, or a small number of firms take it all, that kind of thing, or a small number of firms take most. So, yeah.
I mean, maybe this is a good point to think a little bit beyond kind of the bottom line of businesses, and thinking about welfare in society as a whole, and are these algorithms, are these A/B testing frameworks good or bad for society? And it wasn't in your sort of presentation, but let's venture into that space a little bit. And maybe one way to think about it is sort of, let's take Amazon, for example. Jeff Bezos, their business model, as far as I understand, is to basically be obsessed about the customer, right? Like, he wanted to understand everything about the customers, right? And you cannot sit in an office and be a hippo and, actually learn about every customer and sort of the heterogeneity of preferences, basically. And so, they basically have set up an experimental platform to understand the heterogeneity of preferences, and then have tailored products and offerings and perhaps pricing based on that. And if we take away the price discrimination, you could argue that they're offering products that people love, right? And that has, welfare consequences that are positive for society, right? So how do you see this, the best company that satisfies the preferences of people, yes, they might grow, and then there's a competition problem, but so there's an interesting kind of trade-off there.
I think that's exactly right. I think, and so I think there's a real tension between the companies that succeed here, that really do match consumers to what they want. That is potentially welfare enhancing, because consumers are getting what they want when they want it. But in the absence of competition, that company will extract the rents, right? So, and I've made this argument in the context of Google that you know, for a while Google was sort of a generic monopolist, but as it collected ever more data, location data, interest data, demographic data, it became a discriminating monopolist. And when you're a discriminating monopolist, then you're really extracting all the rents. And that's then where you need competition to dissipate those rents and return them back to customers. So,
very good. There's a question here. So in your opinion, experimentation or A/B testing becomes must-have skill for any digital business. Is it a must-have skill? Like, do you need at least one person?
I mean, look, I wouldn't go, I think in the, you know, one thing that Amazon is good at, and as I've read, is this working backwards, right? And so if I look forward into the future, I see that companies will have these skills, and the companies that do have these skills will have the competitive advantage. Now, is it a must-have skill today? Well, that's a process. And so it depends, I mean, as in any business decision, it depends on the incremental benefit versus the incremental cost. And so, but of course, this is a new domain or new area for many businesses. So I would just say, try it. Go back to trying it. I mean, at some level, not try building an experimentation platform, that's pretty expensive, but try some simple A/B testing and just see what you think.
Yeah.
And then if that wheel rolls for you, if that flywheel goes, super. And if not, then not.
So related to that, there's a question about basically the hippo in the company.
Yeah.
So the following question is, my impression is that in business, data is often used to retrofit an already made opinion. How do you get a manager to trust the data more than their intuition, right? And I guess that's the interesting part when the data starts contradicting what you have been preaching internally for years, right? There's almost like a psychology now entering the playbook, sort of, or the, you know.
So let me just say, I've worked in policy, and so therefore worked for lawyers, and there's definitely this retrofit problem. Look, I think at the end of the day, as I mentioned, at some level there has to be some belief on the part of business leaders to give this a try. So if like the most senior leader in a company says, forget it, it's just not going to happen, right? So someone needs to be willing to roll the dice, so to speak, and then you just have to see if you get those aha moments, and they go, I mean, because really, you know, when you see those, and someone who long thought, they just, you know, and they're experienced in the industry, and they really believe something, and they go, wow, actually, wow, you know, and then they go, okay, maybe we should do more of this, right? Because it says, maybe my long-held beliefs about how our industry works isn't totally right. And so, but you do need that openness at the beginning, at least.
Yeah. It requires some sort of humbleness about your own beliefs potentially being wrong. There's a few questions here about the role of academia, and I think you also highlighted that towards the end. You know, and you talked about this gap basically between what the business needs and, you know, business leaders that kind of know, you know, their businesses, but they don't have the technical skills. Then on the other hand, you have the econometrician or the data scientist or the professor that sort of knows the toolbox, but then how do you get these two to work together, right? And what role do you see for academia to maybe train the next generation of you know, students to kind of meet this potentially big demand that's going to be out there?
So I see a huge role for academia. And in part, you know, I'm still a professor at the University of Zurich. I still teach an econometrics course, and I talk
my colleague.
Exactly, and I teach econometrics to master students, and I say exactly this point, which is universities are going to play a critical role because, and what I see is that the next generation of business leaders are going to need these technical skills. So what's then the most efficient way to do it? So I mentioned PhD economists sometimes look, it's not like I planned that I would have these skills. It was just raw luck that the things I happened to be good at happened to be useful in this other domain, right? It's not like I was brilliant and looked forward and saw that. But PhDs take a long time, right? So it's not clear that that's the most efficient way to transfer those skills to the next generation of business leaders. So my view actually is there should be something like an economics and data science MBA, which doesn't really exist now. MBAs do have often, one or two courses on sort of data analysis and this kind of thing. But what I'm really thinking about is needed is making the investments to give those three skills, right? So economics, so business, obviously, but then economics for both the causal inference part and then just the underlying functioning of consumer and firm behavior, right? And then data science because there are prediction problems, right? And then maybe a little bit of engineering too, just enough so that they can have useful conversations with the professional engineers. So I think that's business education will need to change. You start to see this like Stanford and NYU, right, are starting to do this. So it's something we should be thinking about it too.
100% agree.
Yeah.
It would be nice if we could do something like that here in Switzerland at some point, or sooner rather than later. Final question. We don't actually. I think we don't have time. Do we have time for one more question? Okay. We haven't really talked about AI. Mm-hmm. I see a few questions about AI here, and AI in many ways is sort of. How do you think about AI now? AI is sort of a technology that's also different today than it was 6 months ago, 12 months ago, and it's probably going to be different, a year from now. So how does sort of AI fit into this framework that you have?
Yeah. So look, I think everything I'm going to share are just initial impressions because I think everyone agrees it's early days, right? That AI is sort of a multi-purpose technology and its best business use cases haven't been fully developed. What I would say, so even Zalando, we have a new virtual assistant that uses sort of the generative AI methods to help consumers try to find the clothes that are most interesting to them. But I think the next generation is going to be really diffusing through sort of all business or some business processes. And the way I would frame it is in the two types of questions I talked about, there were these forecasting questions and then there were these what if questions, the causal inference questions. Where I see AI as being incredibly powerful, potentially powerful, is in this forecasting space. I mean, at the end of the day, to me, it's a incredibly powerful machine learning tool, right? Or a forecasting tool. And so I can see potential step changes in the efficiency and effectiveness of prediction. Where I don't see a big effect is more these what if questions. Like if I'm really changing the world, predicting isn't, like knowing the best AI model in the world that could, predict exactly what would happen in some data series, for example, isn't going to be helpful if I'm changing the underlying structure of that data series, right? So I think it could be powerful in one of the two phases, but most of what I've been talking about is in the second phase with these what if causal kinds of questions. And it's still, there is a blend now. There's this research indeed by Susan Athey and colleagues and Viktor Chernozukov about causal forests that take the best of machine learning with the best of causal inference. And I think there's potential there. In observational data methods, but at the end of the day, I'm convinced there's still going to be a huge need for, at the end of the day, experimentation because that just gives you the cleanest insights.
That makes sense. Yeah. We also don't know where the technology is going to go, right? So you could imagine that some decision making could be automated as well, perhaps.
That's true.
But that's more speculative.
Yeah.
Very good. So I'd like to thank you so much, Greg, for a fantastic talk, and I really enjoyed this conversation. I would also like to thank the audience for watching and for your questions. I would like to take this opportunity now to draw your attention to our next lecture. On March 20th, Austrian Federal President Alexander van den Bellen will be our guest. He's a trained economist and was a professor at the University of Vienna, where he served as Dean of the Faculty of Social and Economic Sciences. He will speak about the future of Europe. 2024 is a super election year. You have the European parliamentary elections, and then you have the presidential elections in the US. Both elections will have a major impact on the future development of Europe, arguably. in addition to the current general climate, in addition the climate is clouded, we see various conflicts around the world in Ukraine, Middle East. We see an aging population in various Western societies, declining birth rates, and political polarization. So he will talk about some of the biggest challenges that he sees for Europe, but it's not just going to be a gloomy talk. He's also going to talk about the opportunities that lie ahead. So that's very exciting. Please subscribe to our newsletter to receive updates about that event and other events. And we look forward to welcoming you back in March. And in the meantime, I invite you to follow the discussion on social media, X, LinkedIn, YouTube. You can also find all the information on the forum on the UBS Center website, ubscenter.usedge.ch. Thanks so much. Goodbye.